much for that nice introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here on what is a very strange January day. It's so warm out that it's hard to know whether to celebrate or get worried about global warming, but I'm not going to talk about either particularly today. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all the members who were responsible for this invitation. And though I'm a historian by training and by occupation, I'm actually going to start out by talking about the present, and I promise we'll kind of go backwards and go back to the present again in a moment. And I probably won't surprise you if I start out by saying that truth's actually been having a bit of a rough time of it lately. Maybe not least, sort of if you go due south here about, about 100 and some miles to Washington, D.C. And I'll start with the most obvious example, but I will then, I promise, not dwell on that. But the most obvious example may be the current US president. And I think I'm saying something objectively true by saying that much of what the current president says is objectively false. The Washington Post, as probably many of you know, is keeping a kind of record, a fact-checking record, and they're up to 15,000 something since inauguration, and this is a kind of tally that continues every day. What we know is that President Trump often pushes falsehoods about his own past actions or those of others, which might be more simply known as lies. And he also, like parts of his administration, routinely conveys inaccurate or unverified information, which is a little different from lying, whether it's about sort of research findings or something he or someone else has witnessed. And then in between this comes a kind of muddying of the waters, where something gets said like, people are saying, or we don't really know, or I've been hearing, or it's all fake news. And I'll give you one highly publicized example, not the most important certainly, but I think it shows you something of the pattern. So rather than, I could talk about Iran this week or about the impeachment hearings, but let me give you a small example. This fall, the president claimed that Alabama was among the states most likely to be hard hit by what was known as Hurricane Dorian. And the National Weather Service of Birmingham then quickly tweeted a disavowal, saying Alabama was actually not going to be impacted. And normally this might have ended with some sort of, admission of a mistake, not a big deal, misspoke, said they were name of the wrong state. But the president proceeded first to show a doctored official national weather map, though he said he didn't know who had made it, but creating what we might not call a kind of false form of documentation, because now you have a map, it's supposed to be a kind of neutral piece of information, but it's been altered to reflect some kind of political statement. Then he got another government agency, the parent organization of the National Weather Service, some days later to defend his claim with a statement saying that the Birmingham Bureau had been mistaken, which then takes another form of what should be pretty neutral information, a weather bureau broadcast, not a particularly political kind of information source, and turns it into a kind of politically motivated disinformation. And then finally, when this gets reported, he repeatedly insisted over days that the problem wasn't his information, it was the fake news media reporting, thereby sort of further sowing doubts, and this would be sort of comical except for the effect, which is, I think, to produce a sense of who knows who or what to believe when you have kind of competing sources of what should be neutral information. But I'm not going to dwell in my remarks really on Trump or his accolades, and this isn't really just about the US. I think that's important too. That according to reports from all over the world, both misinformation and disinformation are circulating with new force in lots of parts of the globe. And this is happening from governments themselves, to party platforms, to social media feeds, where in fact we're all sort of producers and consumers of information all the time. And maybe most seriously, what opinion polls show, especially in the US, is that a lot of people don't care, in the sense that, on the contrary, they seem to almost embrace this kind of fuzzy distinction between truth and falsehood. Some people value political leaders' personal authenticity, their sense that they're telling it like it is, or cutting through what's PC or some kind of bullshit to that's more important than veracity or accuracy. That's one possibility. Another is that some people simply want to win, truth be damned. And many people, and these days more heavily on the right, political right, but this doesn't have to be the case. You might say, if you think back to the Vietnam War era, Paul Simon, for instance, here, this would have been more a phenomenon of the left, have come to see that everything that establishment culture touts as a fact is actually a matter of opinion or spin, rejecting in some cases the idea that there is any impartial information or objective information out there, or that there's any way to get to that there are any neutral arbiters of information. And conversely, fake news, for example, has become both a partisan expression and a kind of all-purpose description of the world, being adopted as far afield as places like Myanmar to deny reports of the attempted genocide of the Muslim minorities. As you undoubtedly know, in 2016, so this is just after Brexit and just before the last presidential election, post-truth was named the word of the year by Oxford English dictionaries. And the reason for this description, and this is interesting, it's kind of prescient, you know, the dictionaries always chart what words are on the rise, but also seem to sort of describe the moment. Sometimes they're new technical words, sometimes they're political terms. And the idea was not just that disinformation was circulating in record levels, but that people had lost any kind of common ground about where you might find truth and how you'd get there, and that as a result, democracy itself was in a kind of existential crisis. And this wasn't just in the UK either, post-Faktisch in Germany had the same fate in that year. And some of us might say, and I don't mean to start with too depressing a note, but some of us might say that the situation actually looks a little worse a few years later. This was fall 2016, so where are we now? Quite a few years later in the new election cycle. But now we can point to several additional factors. One is new technological capabilities that make it easier than ever to produce convincing falsehoods. Some of you may have heard of deep fakes, for instance, that would allow, I could be speaking, saying one thing, but you could easily program me so that I was saying something else. And it would be quite convincing visually. That wasn't really even feasible a few years ago. We can also point to the growing number of states that are engaged in something that now goes by the name of information warfare, which is to say the deliberate dissemination either domestically or internationally of false information, sometimes aided by for-profit groups like Cambridge Analytica in the UK is the best known of these. We can point to decreasing trust in institutions that are supposed to be kind of guardians of consensual truths. The press particularly, but also to a certain degree universities and research centers. And finally, I think we know a little bit more now about we have more evidence maybe for the nefarious effects of this kind of disinformation, ranging from Facebook-inspired murders that took place of perceived child abductors in India to growth of anti-immigrant sentiment in much of the world, often stoked by fears and kind of false information that gets virally circulated. So that's a pretty depressing summation, I think, especially since here we are in the new year on this beautiful day. But because I'm a historian, I think that before we conclude ever that we're sort of post anything or anything is over, we need to have some real sense of what came before. And then we can sort of assess what's different, what's not, and also what to do. And my subject really today, and this is indeed the subject of my recent book, Democracy and Truth as well, is to ask kind of what happened? How did we get to this point? How did the marriage of democracy and truth, which was supposed to be a very good one, how did it go so astray? And that's the kind of question that interests me. It might be a slightly odd question, it sounds like, because it's so abstract for a historian to take up. But I've spent a lot of my career as a historian thinking about just this kind of problem, which is to say the kinds of big assumptions that we tend to take for granted because they undergird all our political debates. They don't belong to the right or left in any particular way. They're not the subject of controversy because they're so widely assumed in some way that we don't spend a lot of time dwelling on them. And I think the nature and value of truth in democracy is one of those, which is to say, we only talk about it when it's under threat. But it's vital to uncover what that relationship looks like if we're going to figure out what the problem is now. And if we look closely, I'm going to say, and you're going to think, well, only a historian would say that, but that the story is not as recent in its entirety as much of the media would have you believe, that the big story doesn't start in 2016 with Brexit and the last presidential election. It doesn't start actually in 2005, which some of you may remember, it's not even that long ago, was right about when all the major social media companies got off the ground, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. It doesn't even start in the 1980s and 90s, which some of you remember is about when radio was deregulated in the US. Talk radio came in. Modern talk radio came to fruition then, as did 24-hour kind of infotainment television, of which we now have many cable channels. All of those certainly matter to the last part of the story, for sure. Those are important developments. And I'm happy to talk a little more about them later too, informally, with anybody who's interested in any of those subjects. But I do think the full story has to take us back a little deeper to what I would call a truth regime. And that sounds like a jargony expression, but what I mean by that is in every culture, how truth is conceived of, how it's found, how it's understood, even why it's valued is a little different. And I'm interested in the fact that the truth regime in which modern democracy was founded, in which it's essentially baked, is that of the transatlantic Enlightenment, in which of course Philadelphia is a major component. This can be a local story as much as an international one. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take a kind of deep dive back for a little bit, about 250 years into the Age of Revolutions that began in North America and then France, and then we'll kind of very quickly work our way forward to the present and sort of come back to what this dilemma of today looks like. Because the reason I think this is important is because at the core of the Enlightenment, and if you'll let me generalize a little bit around cross-geography here, at the core of the Enlightenment was a kind of single preoccupation. How do we collectively eradicate error and myth and false belief, which seem to many people to permeate thinking on topics ranging from sex to rulership? How do you get rid of false beliefs and get closer to something like an accurate picture of what the world is really like? And some people had responses that we would now describe as falling in the category of epistemology, or kind of methods. How do you know things? But other people responded that you had to change social and political conditions for something like truth to surface. And in the second half of the 18th century, critics of monarchy on both sides of the Atlantic, and you can think of here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Paris and Tom Paine down the street or something like that, developed a particularly novel argument. They claimed that one advantage of republics, which was the term used then for what would come in the 19th century to be known as democracies, one advantage of republics is that they would have a uniquely close relationship to truth. So this is a kind of rhetorical position that develops. Whereas kings, like priests and indeed aristocrats, had relied on secrecy and cunning and deception as ways of rule, even valuable tools of rulership, republics, they said, would thrive on an exactly opposite set of values. Transparency, everything would be naked, visible to the naked eye. Evidence, or demonstrated proof, and even personal sincerity. So this writer, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, for instance, who's a friend of Rousseau's, very enamored of Rousseau, tries to imagine the world of the future. He picks the year 2440. We're not there yet. We don't know if he's going to be right. But he said in the future, the world would look like a big book of morals. Everyone would be, slightly terrifying idea, everybody would be legible to everybody else, and lying would be a crime. But this was the sort of imaginary of the 18th century. And moreover, truth and democracy were envisioned as sort of supporting each other. So in other words, established truths, meaning basic moral and factual ones, not big existential ones, but sort of basic truths would be the foundation for democratic deliberation. But also democratic deliberation, whether in debates or votes, would contribute to producing something like consensual truth. And this was an idea that was appealing to Enlightenment types, it was appealing in the early capitalist marketplaces. And the idea is that republics would make something like virtue and knowledge, or truth-seeking and truth-telling, so both the kind of moral sense and the epistemological sense would come together. So if you read 18th century writers, they talk about truth constantly. The Marquis de Condorcet is in prison, he's about to be executed as part of the French Revolution, and he says everybody around him is driven by the quest for truth. He just imagines that that's what the driving force is. James Madison, in the middle of the Alien Sedition Acts in 1790, says something similar. He says, in a republic, light will prevail over darkness, truth over error. And I bring this up because I guess to some degree, I think we still have some conviction in this front, or we wouldn't be so worried about what it means for truth to be in crisis if we didn't actually believe truth and democracy need each other in a certain way. So that's the first point. But like with everything, there's a catch here. And this is also, I think, where things get tricky. So think of the strategic use of we, and we hold these truths to be self-evident. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. The opening, of course, of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the first sort of announcing of what a large republic could look like in the modern world. Because 18th century Republican thinkers also believed that what would distinguish truth under conditions of popular sovereignty, and by this I mean moral and factual truths, not so much logical ones, so not 2 + 2 = 4, but truths that we need to live by. And what they imagined is that these truths would be collective. They'd be kind of communal conclusions. No one person, one institution, or even one sector, so no king, no priest, no national research body, no one caste would get to call all the shots. Moreover, truth, and again I'm talking about moral and factual ones, not simply logical ones, would never be definitive either. It wouldn't be dogma. Instead, truths would be always subject to kind of renegotiation, rethinking, as the collectivity changed its mind in some sense. Something like what scholars now call public knowledge, which is just really jargon for saying something we've sort of all decided on in some informal way, would be worked out through some kind of back and forth. Not very spelled out how we get there, but that was the idea. And to make this work, the idea is that a small number of people would play sort of specialized leadership roles, either inside or outside of government, because they had specialized knowledge. And a larger number of people, though not everyone, and we can always come to the fact that democracies always have exclusions in terms of who counts as the people anyway, a larger number of people would operate with whatever kind of everyday knowledge they had simply because they were citizens who lived in the world. And together, somehow loosely, they would reach a kind of basic consensus about what causes what, what's broadly desirable, what's dangerous, and how to characterize what's already happened. And you find that idea in people like Condorcet and Jefferson in the 18th century, and you find it all the way up through people like John Dewey at the end of the 19th, John Rawls in the late 20th century. It's been a kind of enduring strain of democratic thought. And all this would transpire, it was assumed, starting in the Age of Revolutions, following almost mystically kind of 2 basic principles. One you would call plain speech, which is to say talking simply, not using the obscure, difficult, euphemistic language of aristocrats, as it was imagined, but rather a kind of, think of Ben Franklin and a kind of simple language, that this would allow us to understand each other overcome our religious differences, our class differences, our regional differences. The sans-culotte in France had the same idea. So that's one idea, was plain speech would get us there. The other was free speech, which of course quickly got enshrined in law. And that was the idea, it goes all the way back to John Milton, that some kind of competition in ideas, competition in books and magazines, newspapers, and just information would, in a world in which it's hard to be absolutely certain about anything, work to dispel errors over time, including those born of religious orthodoxy. So this was the strange, in a sense, I think, truth regime that democracy was born in. This combination of commitment to truth, but a very messy, complicated way of getting there that didn't involve anyone having any real absolute authority over that domain. And what that's meant, if we now turn from that, we've been talking a little bit about what you might call political theory, and if we move over to talking about political practice, is that truth has never been self-evident at all in modern democracies. In fact, it's always been something to fight over. And I might say that even today, when we're having arguments about education or arguments about press freedom or something, often what we're really arguing about is who gets to say what's true and how. And what's more, and this is really, I think, the key point for understanding the sort of background to what's happening now, the democratic truth process has continually been threatened since the 18th century by those who've tried to monopolize it, which is to say, take it out of this sphere of contentious but collaborative debate and kind of hustle it away and try to come up with the exclusive right to define it. And sometimes that threat has come from knowledge elites, which is what in the 19th century got termed as experts. Today we might call them policy makers or something like that. People who claim they have superior access to truth and trustworthiness on account of their specialized training, which traditionally has also meant something about their race and gender and relative wealth. And that's especially the case when those experts have insisted upon the validity of their knowledge in isolation, that is kind of without the leavening effect of ordinary people's views too. And there's a long, interesting story here. I mean, experts have been important to government since early modern times. Statecraft requires map makers and experts in population and military experts. And as government's grown in function, the number of people needed to come up with this information has grown exponentially. And of course, democracy has also been fueled by a certain fear of ordinary people's knowledge. That's why we still have, for instance, the Electoral College, which is to say these kind of institutions meant to sort of serve as buffer zones so that the people alone are not the arbiters of truth. Today, when you want to talk about the dangers of too much expert rule or even technocracy, the most classic example is often the European Union, where people talk about, sort of lots of bureaucrats gathered in Brussels debating things with no sense that fishing laws is often an example, for instance, that there are no fishermen in the room, but all these kinds of experts come up with complicated treaty negotiations that are sort of not just that ordinary people haven't participated in the process, but that they're kind of removed from the lived experience of people who both fish and live off the proceeds of fishing. So that's kind of half the story. It's been, I think, the growth of expertise into its own, sometimes, domain of truth. But that's half the story. The other half, the other threat to truth, has come at times from those claiming to speak exclusively for ordinary or real people, the kind of people whose knowledge comes exclusively from living in the world, kind of people who might say, I don't need to know what climate experts say at the National Science Foundation. I can tell you that today is a warm day, or I can tell you it was cold last year in my backyard. And that tradition is long too, and it too has grown over time. We can go all the way back to Tom Paine talking about, the real people know better, and trying to break through the language of experts and rulers in the 18th century. Moving forwards, we can talk about a whole tradition, especially in American life, of attacks on, say, Harvard men and fat cats and all sorts of expressions that emerge in the 19th century to decry kind of elites that are out of touch with what ordinary people's knowledge is. And while many important social movements have, of course, begun with claims to what ordinary people know and, in this sense, are invaluable to democracy, the claim sometimes, the one we're seeing now that is, I think, dangerous in its own regard, is the idea that all expertise is unnecessary, that in a sense, when the real people reclaim knowledge as their own domain, exclusively, that some kind of higher truth will prevail. Because ironically, while both elite knowledge, born of education, and common sense perspectives are vital to democracy as first imagined, either mode without the other can lead not just to bad policies, it can lead, I think, to the dismantling of democracy, which depends on a kind of pluralism, a contentious pluralism, but pluralism nevertheless. And it's Maximilien Robespierre, you may be surprised to hear, who did so much to forge both what constitutes democracy today and the modern police state, who sort of saw the risk very early on from both sides. He said, and I'll read you this quote, "Democracy perishes by two excesses, the aristocracy of those who govern," we might call that the tyranny of the ruling class or something like that, or the contempt of the people for the authorities which it has itself established, a contempt in which each faction or individual reaches out for the public power and reduces the people through the resulting chaos to nullity or the power of a single man. And there he's imagining what we'd call demagoguery. Champions of liberal democracy have, in a sense, been trying to ward off both threats ever since. To some degree, they've succeeded, but as Max Weber, the famous German social scientist, said in the 1920s, there's always going to be a problem when democracy and what he called bureaucracy run up against one another. The more you democratize, the more you need kind of experts to manage things, but the more experts manage things, the more they separate themselves from the people. And with the added effects of recent times, I think in some ways Weber got it right, that we're reaching a kind of moment in which the acceleration of both trends, both claiming some kind of exclusivity, has come to fruition. And that brings us really back to the present. And I'm going to conclude in a few minutes. But I want to just address this question first of what can we do? And here I was interested in your answers, as you probably are in mine, in that I have no secret formulas. But if we accept that this kind of technocratic truth and this populist truth have been on a long-term collision course, but their antagonism and desire to eliminate each other has recently been ramped up in unprecedented ways, in part by technological and media shifts. I don't know if you're all addicted to your phones, I'm afraid I am, but this has become a kind of general condition. And in part by economic dislocation and deregulation on a large scale. If we take that to be sort of the way things are, the question still rests, is there anything we can do? Is this all just sort of inevitable? And here I have to tread carefully because first of all, I'm an historian, not a prognosticator, and secondly, because the stakes are kind of high. As Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish philosopher of the mid-century, famously pointed out, when it comes to truth, there's danger of doing too little and there's danger of doing too much. Too little, in other words, you just sort of shrug your shoulders and say, that's how it is. You risk fascism or totalitarianism, in which everyone simply accepts that most of what you hear is a lie and expects nothing different. Too much, and you get something more like the reign of terror, an obsession with unmasking every person and every claim. So I think we can think about this on different scales, trying to avoid the sort of too much or too little problems. Briefly, at the most micro level, we can, I think, encourage these kinds of efforts like the Washington Post at fact-checking, even though they sometimes backfire and end up pushing, say, conspiracy theories to people's attention when they wouldn't have otherwise, but I think a record of the truth does matter. And we can try to encourage new information habits, including in the young, about understanding where information comes from and how to know what's legitimate and what's not. Those are the very small suggestions, and they're unlikely to have a very large impact for sure. At the grandest level, maybe national or even global political change, the hill is a lot steeper, but we might still push hard for policies that reduce income inequality, so we're not so very far from each other in terms of experience, lived experience, and opportunity, that we seem to be inhabiting totally different worlds, as sometimes the US can seem these days, for instance. And I think we can step away from seemingly obsolete notions that we are all just living in a marketplace of ideas, as it came to be known in the 20th century, and demand more actual regulation of media businesses, so that truth and not sensationalism or popularity shapes more the algorithms that determine what comes up first on your phone, more openness in terms of when you see a political ad, in terms of who paid for it, where does it come from. I think that media companies will not self-regulate, as it's known, and there needs to be more effort to hold them accountable in some way that matters. And in the middle, I think we have to do more to support institutions concerned with the production or discovery or diffusion of truth, and that would mean colleges and universities, libraries certainly, centers like this, and especially schools in which people would be taught both a healthy skepticism about truth, which is part of the democratic tradition itself, not taking things for granted, but also some sense of how do you get to something close to verifiable information? How do you come to know something with as much certainty as you can? For in the end, I would say that verifiable truth does matter to democracy, no matter how contentious it is. Some forms of truth, say medical information, might be able to thrive without democracy. But democracy itself, I think, cannot really survive without a foundation in truth. At the most basic level, a commitment to truth-telling is essential to the kind of trust of other people on which we all operate. Slightly more importantly, maybe, the necessity of sound information or factual truth is premised from the start, and the democratic debate can't really exist unless we sort of have some place to start with. For instance, how would we debate what to do about unemployment, for which we might have very different solutions, very different attitudes, but if we can't first agree if unemployment has gone up or down in recent months. The idea of debate is usually that there's some kind of foundation upon which opinion can then develop. But even more, and those are the sort of more practical ends, even more, I think democracy requires truth as a key aspiration. For without this aspiration towards knowing more and the conviction it might be possible, there's not that much reason we would want to continue to live, I don't think, in such a messy or precarious way as we do under this. And so some of you might think to yourself, maybe we don't actually need democracy either. It isn't working very well. And maybe it's just a nice kind of papering over of various forms of exclusion or domination or injustice. And there's an argument that truth could be just one more of its mythologies, something we tell ourselves to feel better. But democracy, as reimagined in the 18th century, I think, has the extraordinary virtue of always providing for the possibility of second or third or even fourth chances. And that's because of its relationship to truth. By this way of thinking, democracy's great advantage is not the empirical outcomes it generates, but rather the idea that we're never certain we've gotten it right, and that's okay. And I think only if we can imagine this kind of epistemic and moral progress towards a truer view of reality can we begin to rectify the gaps between democratic theory and how we actually live. And so let me end by saying that I hope, in the end, looking at this problem through a slightly historical lens provides a modest form of hope. It demonstrates that humans can make collective choices about what happens next, and that truth and democracy is something that we all have to work to forge. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.